One number changed everything. One decision by one institution, and nobody saw it coming. For decades, the world worked because of a quiet partnership. It was a deal that was never written down on a single piece of paper, but it was the foundation of everything you see around you. On one side, you had the United States. The Americans wanted to build, to spend, and to grow. They wanted cheap houses and new cars. They wanted a government that could do everything without raising taxes. To do that, the United States needed to borrow money. They needed a lot of it, trillions of dollars. On the other side of the ocean, you had China. China was changing fast. They were building factories that could make everything the world wanted to buy, from the phone in your pocket to the shoes on your feet. When China sold those things to Americans, they didn't get paid in their own money. They got paid in US dollars. But China couldn't just keep all those dollars sitting in a warehouse. They needed to put that money somewhere safe. They needed a place where the money would grow just a little bit every year. And they found the perfect spot. They started buying US Treasury bonds. Think of a Treasury bond like a high-tech IOU. It is a promise from the American government. If you give us your money today, we will pay you back later with a little bit of extra cash on top. For a long time, these bonds were considered the safest thing on Earth. People called them risk-free. They were the bedrock of the entire global financial system. If everything else failed, the bond was the one thing you could trust. China loved them. Year after year, they sent ships full of goods to America. And year after year, they took those dollars and bought more bonds. By the time our story starts, China owned a massive amount of this debt, $700 billion. It is a number so big it is hard to imagine. If you tried to count it out, $1 at a time, it would take you more than 20,000 years. This was the invisible deal. The Americans got to keep borrowing money at very low interest rates. This meant mortgages were cheap, car loans were cheap, credit cards were easy to get, and China got a safe place to store their wealth. Both sides seemed happy. But there was a catch. This whole system was built on one single word: trust. The Americans trusted that China would keep buying the debt. China trusted that the debt would always be worth something. The rest of the world watched this and assumed it would never end. They thought the two biggest economies were like two hikers tied together on a mountain. If one fell, they both fell. So surely, neither one would ever cut the rope. It would be suicide. Why would China destroy the value of the very thing they owned? It didn't make any sense. But things were changing behind the scenes. The relationship was getting colder. Small arguments turned into big fights. People in Beijing started to wonder if they were too dependent on the dollar. People in Washington started to wonder if they were too dependent on Chinese money. The rope between the two hikers was starting to fray. And then, on a Tuesday morning that looked like any other day, someone in Beijing made a phone call. They didn't want to buy more bonds. In fact, they didn't even want to keep the ones they had. They decided to sell. Not a little bit. All of it. They were about to press the sell button on $700 billion. And the world was about to find out exactly what happens when the bedrock of the global economy simply disappears. It starts with a flicker on a computer screen in a trading room in New York. Then another flicker in London. And another in Tokyo. At first, the traders don't understand what they are seeing. They see a sell order for US Treasury bonds. It is a big order. $10 billion. In the world of global finance, $10 billion is a lot of money, but the market can usually handle it. The price of the bonds dips just a little bit. Then another order hits. $20 billion. Then $50 billion. The traders start to lean forward in their chairs. They are waiting for the buyers to show up. Usually, when the price of a safe bond drops, people rush in to buy it. It is like a sale at a department store. But this morning, the buyers are staying quiet. They are watching the screens, and they are starting to feel a cold knot in their stomachs. To understand why this is a nightmare, you have to understand how a sale works. If you want to sell something, someone else has to want to buy it. If you are selling a used car and 10 people want it, you get a good price. If nobody wants it, you have to keep dropping the price until someone says yes. In the bond market, the price is linked to something else. It is linked to the interest rate. When the price of a bond goes down, the interest rate goes up. It is like a seesaw. As China keeps pressing the sell button, the price of the bonds begins to crash, and the interest rates on those bonds begin to scream upward. This is the moment the panic turns into a wildfire. Most people think the bond market is just something for rich people in suits. They think it doesn't affect their daily lives. They are wrong. The interest rate on a 10-year US Treasury bond is the most important number in the world. It is the math that decides every other interest rate. When that number goes up, everything else goes up with it. The interest rate on your mortgage, it is tied to the bond market. The interest rate on a small business loan, it is tied to the bond market. The interest rate the government pays to keep the lights on, it is tied to the bond market. In a normal year, these rates move by tiny fractions of a percent. They move like a slow-moving river. But on this morning, the river has turned into a waterfall. By midday, the screens in every trading room on the planet are a deep, consistent red. China has sold $100 billion, then $200 billion. They aren't even looking for a good price anymore. They just want out. They are dumping the debt as fast as the computers can process the numbers. The private banks that usually buy these bonds are terrified. They are seeing the value of the bonds they already own disappear in real time. If they buy more now, they might lose billions of dollars by lunch. So, they do the only thing they can do to survive. They stop buying. They walk away from the table. This is what experts call a liquidity crisis. It is a fancy way of saying the plumbing of the world has stayed frozen. The money has stopped moving. Imagine you go to a grocery store, and everyone is trying to sell their groceries back to the store at the same time. And the store manager says they don't have any cash left to buy them. The whole system just stops. In the bond market, this stop is a death sentence for the economy. If the government can't sell bonds, it can't pay its bills. It can't pay the soldiers. It can't pay for the hospitals. It can't send out the checks to the elderly. And worse, the interest rates for regular people are now doubling. A mortgage that was 4% yesterday is suddenly 8%, then 10%. The housing market effectively dies in a single afternoon. The leaders in Washington are gathered in a room. The phones are ringing off the hook. The heads of the biggest banks are on the line, and they are all saying the same thing. The market is broken. There are no buyers left. The United States government is looking at a hole in its pocket that is $700 billion wide. They need to find a buyer, and they need to find one right now. But there is only one institution on Earth with enough money to fix a problem this big. There is only one place that can play the role of the buyer of last resort, the Federal Reserve. The people in that room realize they have run out of choices. They are going to have to do something they never wanted to do. They are going to have to start the largest money printing operation in human history. They are about to print trillions of dollars to buy back what China is throwing away. But they know that once they start that machine, they might not be able to turn it off. The panic on the screens was just the beginning. By the next morning, the crisis had arrived at the kitchen tables of regular people. Think about a person trying to buy a house. On Monday, they had a loan locked in at 5%. By Wednesday, the bank called them back. The new rate was 10%. The dream of that house died in a single phone call. It wasn't just houses. It was everything. Businesses that needed to borrow money to pay their workers found that the gates were locked. The interest rates were so high that borrowing money felt like jumping into a fire. In the span of 48 hours, the cost of doing anything in America had doubled. But the biggest problem was in Washington. Every week, the United States government has to borrow more money just to stay open. They do this by holding an auction. It is like a big room where the government says, "Who wants to lend us money today?" Usually, the room is packed. Banks and countries from all over the world fight to get in. But this week, the room was cold. The man in charge of the auction looked out at the chairs. Most of them were empty. The few people who were there were looking at their phones. They weren't there to buy. They were there to watch the wreckage. China wasn't just refusing to buy new debt. They were telling the whole world that the American promise was no longer worth the paper it was written on. And the world was listening. This is the moment when the math of a nation breaks. If the government can't borrow money, it can't function. Think about the people who depend on that money every day. The soldiers guarding the borders. The people waiting for their retirement checks. The doctors in public hospitals. They all expect to get paid on Friday. But the vault was starting to look very thin. The leaders in the government were staring at a clock. They didn't have months to fix this. They didn't even have weeks. The entire American economy was like a giant engine that had run out of oil. If they didn't do something fast, the engine was going to seize up and stop forever. The public didn't know the full details yet, but they could feel the heat from the fire. They saw the stock market crashing on the news every night. They saw the local banks getting nervous about handing out cash. And they started to do the one thing that makes every crisis 10 times worse. They started to panic. The fear was moving from the high-tech trading floors to the local bank branches on the corner. Everyone was looking for a hero, or at least someone with a very large bucket of water to put out the flames. There was only one building left with any power to act, the place where the money is actually born. The people inside that building knew what they had to do, but they also knew it was a trap. If they did nothing, the country would go bankrupt by the end of the month. If they acted, they might destroy the value of the dollar forever. They were staring at the nuclear option, a plan to print more money than had ever been created in the history of the world. They were about to pull the lever. The Treasury Building in Washington is usually a quiet place. It is a place of routine. Every single week, they hold an auction. It is a place where people manage the world's biggest checkbook. But on this day, the silence in the building was different. It is how the United States government gets the money it needs to stay open. It was the silence of a room that was suddenly empty. Imagine a stadium filled with people. Every person in that stadium is a bank or a government from another country. They are all there to do one thing. They want to lend money to the United States. In exchange, they get those IOUs we talked about, the treasury bonds. Usually, the bidding is intense. People are shouting. Computers are whirring. The government asks for $100 billion, and the people in the stadium offer $200 billion. The government gets to pick the best deal. It is a machine that has never failed. But that morning, the stadium was silent. The big banks were there, the representatives from other nations were there, but they weren't bidding. They were sitting on their hands. They were looking at their screens, and what they saw was China selling everything. They saw the price of the bonds crashing in the street. If they bought a bond from the government for $100 now, it might be worth $90 by the time they left the building. So they did the only logical thing. They did nothing. The person running the auction looked at the screen. The clock was ticking down. The government needed to sell $60 billion in debt, but the orders weren't coming in. 10 minutes left, 5 minutes left, 1 minute. When the clock hit 0, they had only sold a tiny fraction of what they needed. The rest of the space was blank. This is what traders call a failed auction, but in Washington, they had a different name for it. They called it the empty chair. The empty chair represented the buyer who didn't show up, and without that buyer, the government was in trouble. Think about how you pay your bills. You have a job. You get a paycheck. You use that money to pay for rent and food. But the United States government doesn't work like that. The government spends way more than it brings in from taxes. It relies on that weekly auction to fill the gap. It is like a person who pays their credit card bill by getting a new credit card every single week. It works perfectly as long as the banks keep giving you cards, but the banks just said no. The news of the failed auction hit the wires instantly. The world realized that the risk-free asset was now full of risk. If the government couldn't borrow money, how would it pay back? The money it already owed? The trust was gone. And as the trust vanished, the interest rates went even higher. It was a circle of fire. The higher the rates went, the less people wanted to buy. And the less people wanted to buy, the higher the rates went. Wanted to buy. And the less people wanted to buy, the higher the rates went. Inside the Treasury, The mood was grim. They started looking at the calendar. They looked at the payments that were due on Friday. Social Security checks for millions of people. Paychecks for the military. Payments to hospitals and schools. They added up the numbers. Then they looked at the cash they had on hand. The math didn't work. They were short. They were very short. This wasn't a political argument about the debt ceiling. This wasn't a debate in Congress. This was a mechanical failure. The ATM was out of cash. The government of the most powerful nation on earth was facing a reality it had never truly considered. They were about to bounce a check. And if the United States bounces a check, the global financial system doesn't just slow down, it shatters. The Secretary of the Treasury picked up the phone. There was only one person left to call, the person who sits in the big building a few blocks away, the head of the Federal Reserve. The message was simple. The auction failed. The room is empty. We need you to step in. This was the moment the nuclear option became the only option. The Fed was being asked to do something that changed the nature of money itself. They were being asked to buy the debt that nobody else wanted. And to do it, they would have to create money out of thin air, trillions of it. The building that houses the Federal Reserve in Washington is built of thick, heavy stone. It is designed to look like a fortress. It is a place where people are supposed to be calm. They are supposed to be the adults in the room when the rest of the world is screaming. But on this afternoon, the people inside were not calm. They were looking at the same screens as the rest of the world, and they knew that the clock had finally run out. The head of the Federal Reserve sat in a quiet office. He had just hung up the phone with the Secretary of the Treasury. The message was clear. The government was out of money. The investors had stayed home. China was still selling. If the Fed did not act in the next few hours, the United States of America would effectively be closed for business. The person in that chair was facing what economists call an impossible choice. It is a choice where every single door leads to a disaster. Behind door number 1 was total collapse. If the Fed did nothing, the interest rates would keep rising until they hit 15%, then 20%. The stock market would lose half its value in a day. Every bank in the country would realize the bonds they owned were worthless. They would stop lending money to everyone. The ATMs would go dark. The grocery stores would stop receiving shipments because no one could pay the truck drivers. This is called a deflationary death spiral. It is how a modern civilization turns into a ghost town. Behind door number 2 was something almost as scary. It was the decision to print the money. Now, the Fed does not actually use a printing press with ink and paper. It is much faster than that. They sit at a computer, they open a digital account, and they type in a number. They could type in a 1 followed by 12 zeros. $1 trillion. With a single click, that money exists. It didn't exist a second ago, but now it does. The plan was simple, but it was massive. The Fed would go into the market and buy every single bond that China was trying to sell. If China wanted to sell $700 billion, the Fed would buy $700 billion. If other countries started selling too, the Fed would buy those as well. They would become the buyer of last resort. They would stand in the gap and stop the price from falling. By doing this, they could force the interest rates back down. They could save the banks. They could make sure the government could still pay its bills. They could keep the lights on. But there is no such thing as a free lunch in economics. Money is like anything else. The more of it there is, the less each piece is worth. If you have a basket of 10 apples, and suddenly everyone in town is given 1,000 apples, your 10 apples aren't very special anymore. By printing trillions of dollars to buy those bonds, the Fed would be flooding the world with new money. This is the nuclear option, because once you do it, you can't take it back. You are basically telling the world that your currency is no longer backed by the strength of your economy. It is backed by a computer that can create wealth out of thin air whenever there is a problem. The people in the room debated for hours. Some said that if they started printing, they would trigger inflation that would last for a decade. They said the price of eggs and gas would go through the roof. They said the dollar would lose its status as the world's money. But The other side of the room had a much shorter argument. They said, if we don't do this, there won't be a country left to worry about next week. They were right. In a crisis this big, you don't worry about the rain next year. You worry about the fire that is burning down your house right now. The decision was made in the late afternoon. The Fed chair gave the order. The computers were prepared. The message was sent out to the big banks and the news agencies. The Federal Reserve was stepping in. They announced they would buy unlimited amounts of debt to stabilize the market. It was a bazooka. It was meant to scare the sellers and give the buyers confidence. They were basically saying to the world, we have an infinite amount of money and we are willing to use it. As the sun began to set in Washington, the digital printing press began to hum. Trillions of dollars began to flow into the system. The interest rates stopped their climb. The panic on the trading floors started to cool down. The nuclear option had worked. The system was saved. But as the leaders walked out of the building, they weren't celebrating. They knew that they had just traded a sudden crash for a long, painful future. They had saved the bond market, but they had just started a fire that would burn the value of every dollar in your pocket. The Federal Reserve Building in Washington is a fortress of stone. It is designed to look like a place where nothing ever changes. Inside, the people are supposed to be the calmest people on earth. They are the guardians of the dollar. But on this day, the silence in the hallways felt different. It felt like the silence before a storm. The head of the Federal Reserve sat in a quiet office. He had just hung up the phone with the leaders of the government. The message was short. The bond market had stopped breathing. China was selling everything. No one else was buying. The United States was hours away from running out of money. The man in that chair was facing a choice that no one should ever have to make. It was a choice between two different kinds of disaster. If he did nothing, the country would collapse. Interest rates would go so high that no one could buy a house or a car. The banks would run out of cash. The economy would simply stop. It would be like a car engine seizing up while driving at 80 miles an hour. But the second choice was just as scary. He could use the power of the Fed to save the day. He could step into the market and buy every bond that China was dumping. But to do that, he needed money. He needed trillions of dollars. And the Fed did not have that money sitting in a vault. They did not have it stored in a basement. They had to create it. Most people think that when the government needs money, they use a printing press. They imagine ink and paper and machines running all night. But in the modern world, it is much faster than that. It happens on a computer screen. The Fed has a special kind of power. They can open a digital account and type in a number. They can type a 1 followed by 12 zeros. $1 trillion. With a single click, that money becomes real. It did not exist a second ago, but now it is part of the world. This is the nuclear option of finance. The Fed decided to pull the lever. They announced to the world that they would buy as much debt as necessary. They told the markets that they had an infinite amount of money. They were basically saying that it did not matter how much China sold. The Fed would always be there to buy it. They were standing in the gap to stop the price from falling any further. When the news hit the trading floors, the panic changed shape. The interest rates stopped their climb. The red screen started to flicker back to green. On the surface, it looked like a miracle. The Fed had used its magic wand to stop the bleeding. The government could pay its bills. The banks were saved. The immediate fire was out. But everyone in that stone building knew the truth. You cannot create trillions of dollars out of thin air without a cost. Money is like anything else in the world. The more there is of it, the less each piece is worth. If everyone in your town suddenly found $1 million on their doorstep, the price of a loaf of bread would not stay at $3 for long. The baker would know that everyone has plenty of cash. The price would go to $10, then $20, then $50. By printing all that money to buy the bonds, the Fed was flooding the world with new dollars. They were saving the bond market, but they were sacrificing the value of the currency. The people who had worked hard and saved their money were about to see their wealth start to melt away. The dollar was no longer backed by the strength of the American economy. It was now backed by a computer that could create money whenever there was a problem. As the sun went down over Washington, the crisis felt like it was over. The headlines said the rescue was a success. The markets were stable. But the air felt heavy. The magic money was already moving through the system. It was flowing into the banks and into the government's accounts. And from there, it was going to flow into the grocery stores and the gas stations. The fire was out, but the house was soaked in water and ruined. And the world was starting to watch the smoke rise. They were seeing that the American promise had changed. It was no longer about being the strongest. It was about being the one who could print the most. The Fed had saved the day, but they had also started a clock that could not be stopped. The ghost of inflation was waking up, and it was going to be much hungrier than anyone imagined. The big bank in Washington did not wait for permission. They did not ask for a vote. They simply opened a digital vault that has no bottom. Inside that building, a few people sat at computer screens. They were looking at the same red numbers that were terrifying the rest of the world. They saw that China was walking away from $700 billion. They saw that the rest of the world was too afraid to step in, so they decided to become the only buyer left on the planet. One person at a desk started to type. They typed a 7 followed by 11 zeros. $700 billion. It was not money that came from taxes. It was not money that had been saved by the government over many years. It was money that was created in the blink of an eye. Think of it like a giant auction where the room is completely silent. The auctioneer is about to give up because nobody wants to buy what is for sale. The building is about to be locked. Suddenly, a voice from the back of the room shouts out a massive number. That voice was the Federal Reserve. They did not just bid once. They told the world they would bid for everything. They said they would buy every single bond that China was dumping, would buy it at a price that would keep the system from breaking. This is what they call the big bank, for a reason. They are the only ones who can never run out of money because they are the ones who make the money. As the buttons were pressed, the new dollars began to flow. They moved through the wires and into the accounts of the big banks. These were the banks that were holding China's old debt. Banks were terrified that they were holding worthless paper. The next moment, their accounts were full of fresh cash. The panic started to fade. The interest rates stopped their climb. The people who were about to lose their homes or their businesses felt a moment of relief. The government looked at its checkbook and saw that it could pay its bills for another week. On the surface, it looked like a perfect rescue. The fire was being smothered by a massive blanket of new dollars. But you have to ask where that blanket came from. When you create $700 billion out of nowhere, you are not creating new wealth. You are not building new factories or growing more food. You are just changing the math of the world. You are taking the value that already exists and spreading it thinner. Imagine you have a big bowl of soup. It is a good, thick soup that can feed 10 people. Suddenly, 10 more people show up, and they are all hungry. You do not have any more ingredients. So you just pour a gallon of water into the pot. Now you have enough soup to fill 20 bowls. Everyone gets a bowl. But the soup is thin. It does not taste like it used to. And it does not keep anyone full for long. That is exactly what the Federal Reserve was doing to the American dollar. Water into the soup. They saved the banks. They saved the government. But they were doing it by making every dollar in your pocket worth just a little bit less. They were trading the future for the present. The traders on Wall Street saw the rescue and cheered. The politicians in Washington saw the rescue and breathed a sigh of relief. But across the ocean, other countries were watching too. Nations like Japan and the countries in Europe and the oil-rich states in the Middle East. They were seeing how easy it was for the Americans to just type their way out of a problem. They saw that the safe bond they had been holding was not actually backed by gold or by work. It was backed by a computer screen in Washington, and they began to wonder if they wanted to be the next ones holding the bag. The rescue had worked for the moment. The immediate crash was gone, but a new kind of fear was starting to grow. It was the fear that the dollar was no longer a prize to be kept. It was becoming a hot potato that no one wanted to hold for too long. The ghost of inflation was no longer a ghost. It was becoming very real. And as the sun set on the day of the Great Rescue, the world was preparing for a very different kind of morning. The fire was out. The bond market was stable again, but as the smoke cleared, the world looked different. The magic money that saved the day did not just disappear once the job was done. It was now moving through the veins of the economy, and it was bringing a new kind of trouble with it. Think about what happens when you double the amount of money in a room, but you do not double the amount of stuff in that room. If there are 10 people and 10 loaves of bread, and everyone has $1, a loaf of bread costs $1. But if you suddenly give everyone $10, the baker is not going to keep the price at $1. He knows everyone has more cash. He knows he only has 10 loaves of bread, so the price goes up to $10. The bread is the same, the hunger is the same, only the number has changed. This is what the world was starting to feel. The Federal Reserve had printed trillions of dollars to buy those bonds from China. That money was now sitting in the accounts of the big banks. The banks did not want to leave it there. They wanted to use that money to make more money. They started lending it out to businesses. They started giving out more credit cards with higher limits. The money was trickling down into the world. At first, it felt like a boom. People saw their bank accounts growing. They saw the stock market reaching new highs because all that new money had to go somewhere. It felt like the crisis was a distant memory. But then, something started to change at the local grocery store. A gallon of milk that used to cost $4 was suddenly $4.50. A few months later, it was $5, then $6. This is the ghost of inflation. It is a quiet thief that does not need to break into your house. It does not take the physical cash out of your wallet while you are sleeping. It just reaches into the value of that cash and pulls it away. One morning, you wake up and realize that the $20 bill in your pocket cannot buy the same lunch it bought last year. The paper is the same color, the face on the bill is the same, but the power of that bill has shrunk. People started to realize that the rescue had a hidden price tag. The government had saved the financial system. They had made sure the banks did not close their doors. They had made sure the government could still pay the soldiers and the retired workers. But they had paid for it by taking a tiny slice of value from every single person who held a United States dollar. Every person who had saved money for a rainy day was effectively paying for the rescue. It was an invisible tax. It was a tax on the grandmother living on her savings. It was a tax on the young couple trying to save for a down payment on a house. While they were sleeping, the goalposts for that house were being moved further away. The magic of the digital printing press was starting to feel like a heavy burden. The more the government printed to fix the problem, the more the problem grew. The people in charge tried to explain it away. They used fancy words to say that the prices would eventually stop rising. They said it was just a side effect of a healthy recovery. But the ghost did not want to leave the house. Once you let that much new money into the system, you cannot just grab it back. The new, higher prices became the permanent prices. The cost of living had taken a step up, and it was not stepping back down. The world was learning a hard lesson about what wealth actually is. Wealth is not the numbers on a screen or the ink on a piece of paper. Real wealth is the things we can actually use to live. It is the corn in the field. It is the gasoline in the tank. It is the wood used to build a home. The Federal Reserve could print $1 trillion in a single afternoon, but they could not print a single ear of corn. They could not print a single gallon of oil. As the months went by, a new kind of frustration began to grow. People were working the same hours. They were doing the same jobs. But they felt like they were falling behind. They were running as fast as they could just to stay in the same place. The trust that had been broken when China sold the bonds was now being replaced by a sense of unfairness. The people saw that the big banks got the new money first, before the prices went up. By the time that money reached the hands of a worker, it had already lost its strength. The bond market was saved. The machines were still running. But the social contract was starting to tear at the edges. The new world was a place where $1 today was always worth more than $1 tomorrow. It was a world of constant movement and constant worry. And as the ghost of inflation settled into every kitchen and every gas station, people began to look for an exit. they began to look for things that no government and no computer could ever print more of. The rescue in Washington was a success on paper. The fires in the bond market were put out. The banks were still standing. But the world was watching. And what they saw was a nation that had solved its problems by changing the rules of the game. For almost 100 years, the United States dollar was the anchor for everyone else. If you were a small country in South America, you saved in dollars. If you were a massive economy like Japan or Germany, you kept your reserves in American bonds. The reason was simple. You believed that the United States would always pay you back with money that had real value. You believed that the Americans would never just create money to make their debts disappear. But the morning after the Great Rescue, that belief was gone. The leaders of other nations looked at the trillions of new dollars the Federal Reserve had just typed into existence. They realized that their own savings, held in those same bonds, were now worth less. It was as if they had a slice of a pie, and the baker had suddenly made the pie twice as large without adding any more ingredients. Their slice was still the same size, but it didn't represent the same amount of food anymore. A quiet conversation began to happen in the capitals of Europe and Asia. It wasn't a loud protest. It was a series of phone calls between finance ministers and heads of state. They all had the same question. If the Americans can just print their way out of a crisis once, what stops them from doing it again? And if they keep doing it, why are we holding our wealth in their currency? This was the beginning of the Great Exit. It didn't happen all at once. It started with small moves. A country like Japan, which owned over $1 trillion in American debt, decided to sell just a little bit. They didn't want to cause a panic. They just wanted to move their money into something else. Maybe gold. Maybe their own infrastructure. Maybe the currencies of their neighbors. But in the world of finance, there are no secrets. When one big player starts to move toward the door, everyone else notices. The nations that sell oil started to ask why they were still pricing their energy in dollars. If the dollar was losing its strength, why should a barrel of oil be tied to it? They started to talk about taking payment in, other forms of money. They started to talk about resource wealth instead of paper wealth. The United States had always been the bank of the world. And the most important rule for any bank is that you cannot lose the trust of the people who keep their money with you. If the people think the bank is being reckless, they will all show up at the same time to take their money out. This is called a bank run. What was happening now was a bank run on a global scale. The Americans tried to tell the world that everything was fine. They said the dollar was still the strongest and most liquid currency on earth. They said there was no other place safe enough to hold trillions of dollars. And for a while, they were right. There was no easy replacement for the dollar. You couldn't just switch the whole world over to a new system in a weekend, but the desire to leave was now stronger than the fear of staying. The other nations began to build their own systems. They created new ways to trade with each other that didn't involve the American banking system. They started to form their own alliances. The world was splitting into different groups. Each group had its own leader. Each group had its own type of money. The era of the unipolar world was ending. This was a world where there was only one center of power, one place that decided the value of everything, one place that could print the world's money. As the other nations backed away, that center began to feel very lonely. The United States was still powerful, but it was no longer the only person at the table. This shift changed everything for the average person back in America. For decades, Americans had enjoyed a special privilege. Because the whole world wanted dollars, the United States could import whatever it wanted from other countries and just send back paper. They could have the best electronics from Asia and the best cars from Europe. The world was happy to take the paper because they trusted the paper. Now, the world wanted more than just paper. They wanted things. They wanted land. They wanted food. They wanted energy. The free ride of the last 50 years was coming to a close. The Great Exit was not just about money. It was about the end of an era where one nation could borrow forever without ever having to pay the bill. The shadow of the crash was long. The bond market stayed quiet, and the interest rates stayed high. But the real change was in the hearts of the people who used to trust the system. They realized that the safety they had felt was an illusion. They realized that the only thing holding the world together was a story everyone had agreed to believe. And that morning, the world had decided to stop believing the story. The shadow of that morning did not last for a few months. It lasted for 100 years. It changed the way people thought about wealth forever. In the old world, wealth was a promise. It was a number in a bank account. It was a bond sitting in a computer in Washington. People believed that the promise was as good as reality. In the new world, people stopped trusting the promise. They wanted things they could touch. They wanted things they could weigh in their hands. They wanted things they could actually use. If you were a nation, you no longer cared as much about how many dollars you had in a vault. You cared about how much oil you had under the ground. You cared about how much wheat you could grow in your fields. You cared about the minerals used to build batteries and the chips used to run computers. The global financial system split into several different groups. Each group had its own leader. Each group had its own type of money. They did not always talk to each other, and they certainly did not trust each other. The era of one single money for the whole planet was over. The dollar was still there, people still used it, but it was no longer the king of the mountain. It was just one player in a very crowded room. This meant that the United States could no longer fix its problems by typing numbers on a screen. If they wanted more energy, they had to trade something real for it. They had to build more. They had to invent more. The free ride of the old system was gone. It was a harder world. It was a more complicated world. But in many ways, it was a more honest world. The illusion of infinite money had been replaced by the reality of limited resources. The long shadow was not a shadow of darkness. It was a shadow of change. It was the moment the world realized that you cannot eat a digital dollar. You cannot build a house out of an IOU. You can only survive on the things the earth actually provides. The world had learned that financial trust is like a bridge. It takes decades to build, but it only takes one morning to burn it down. And once that bridge is gone, everyone has to find a different way to cross the river. The story of the bond dump is not just about numbers on a screen. It is about the invisible rules that keep our world moving. When those rules change, the world changes with them. We have traveled from the quiet deal between two giants to a world that has been split apart. And now, as the dust settles, we can see the lessons that were left behind. The first and most critical lesson is that financial trust is not an emotional state. It is a structural necessity. In the world of global economics, trust acts like the gravity that keeps the planets in orbit. When the United States used its power to print money to save itself, it changed that gravity. It showed the world that the rules could be rewritten in the middle of the game. Once that trust is cracked, it does not matter how many speeches are given. The foundation is different, and the house will never sit quite the same way again. The second lesson is that you cannot print physical reality. A bank can create $1 trillion in less than a second. They can type a number on a screen and make it real in the eyes of the law, but they cannot print a single loaf of bread or a gallon of gas. Wealth is not the paper in your wallet or the digits in your bank account. Real wealth is the corn in the field and the oil in the tank. In a crisis, the world always returns to the things it can touch. The move from paper wealth to resource wealth is the most honest move a society can make. The third lesson is that the era of a world with one single leader is fragile. For a long time, we lived in a world where everything centered on one place. We thought it was the natural state of things. But history shows us that centers of power always shift. The bond dump was the moment the world decided it was time for a new order with many centers. A world with many leaders is more complicated and harder to manage. But it is also a world that is no longer dependent on the decisions of a single building in Washington. Finally, we must understand the true cost of national sovereignty. To be truly free, a nation must be able to stand on its own 2 feet. You cannot build a permanent empire on the savings of your rivals. If you rely on others to fund your lifestyle, you are giving them the power to end that lifestyle. The United States learned that the hard way. The price of independence is the willingness to live within your means. It is a hard lesson to learn, but it is the only way to truly own your future. This is a hypothetical scenario based on the historical record. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict.